cities, the toilets were one of the things that interested us most.
Yeah.
Because we're weird.
Well,
but
it's just cool to think that these people so long ago had plumbing.
every home had indoor toilets and bath, typically, too.
Yeah, like...
World's first. It's amazing how much people got around in these ancient times.
It really
it's always
is.
surprising. People think they all just sat in one place and were isolated, but no.
Each longhouse belonged to an extended family where the women were related by blood. Girl power.
Girl power.
The sewers and, you know, the cesspits and everything like that in there. The level of engineering it took is just pretty amazing.
It's all cool.
It really is.
Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, hello, everybody.
And today we are diving into the second part of The Other Ancient Civilisations by Raven Todd de Silva. You may also know Raven as Dig It with Raven, so if you are interested in more by this creator, definitely check out her YouTube channel and I think TikTok, Instagram as well. So she's definitely around and does quite a lot of content. But before we get into that, here at Archaeology Books for Fun, we are sharing our enthusiasm for archaeology in the past. You can help us reach more people by dropping a like, subscribe, and if you really want to make our day, a comment or a review.
We do love those comments.
We really do. If you want to support us even more, you'll also find a donation link in the description for the episode. So yeah, let's dive in. If you all recall last time, this book is showcasing civilizations that are maybe overshadowed by some other prominent civilizations. Not that those civilizations don't deserve it too, but they also deserve some discussion and some more awareness than they get.
Lesser known, but just as cool.
Yeah, and frankly, also very influential on some of the well-known ones.
Really, yeah,
So definitely worth, if you want to have a full understanding of the situation in the world they lived in, this is definitely worth your time. So yes, we have 5 chapters today and 5 different cultures that we're going to talk about. So it's a little rapid fire. The information on the civilizations they're not necessarily surface level. There are some quite a lot of detail sometimes, but it doesn't feel like it's very complete. And that's just by the nature of this kind of book we're dealing with here.
And she touches on that in her introduction. This isn't meant to be like a very thorough book. It's more of a introduction to these different cultures, and hopefully the reader will get intrigued and go on to study up on them with more reading. Yeah,
or even if you don't, you'll know when you hear Assyrian in the future, maybe you'll know, oh yes, Assyrians, we talked about that book, and you have a little bit of point of reference for it. And so that's on its own is handy to have. So every single chapter starts with a little bit of historical fiction. And so for the first chapter we're covering today, chapter 6 is about the Indus Valley. And this one actually is about a man trying to unclog a sewer, which is actually, if you recall our discussions about Pompeii and Four Lost Cities, the toilets were one of the things that interested us most.
Yeah.
Because we're weird.
Well, it's just cool to think that these people so long ago had plumbing.
And you think about how important it is, though, too.
Yes.
With these dense populations and the disease, having this sort of plumbing is a really big deal and really innovative to come up with solutions for it at this point.
And what's really cool is these folks had even showers.
Yes.
Like, what? That's amazing.
Every home had indoor toilets and bath, typically, too.
Yeah, like, what?
World's first.
They were so cosmopolitan.
Yes. So the area started kind of developing into settlements in 4000 BCE and then kind of matured 2600 BCE. And just kind of give you some point of reference. Yeah, and there's not really any indication of some overarching government governing all these different communities and settlements. But there is some level of agreement on norms and standards still.
Yeah.
Which is interesting how this, because we don't really know quite how they managed this.
Yeah, especially with like the construction of the structures, like they had that specific ratio that they used for dimensions of the brick for different buildings. And that's one of the ways you can kind of tell which buildings may have been public and which ones were private.
Yep. And they had a weight system, a universal weight system that somehow formed. We don't know quite how this happened. Very interesting. Some idea was that the weight system was for all trade, but there's not enough for that, so we think it might have been for taxation or something. Any other major points stand out here for you?
I mean, I'm just obsessed with the fact that they had showers, Tristan.
Yeah.
I think the way she describes the sewers and, the cesspits and everything like that in there, the level of engineering it took is just pretty amazing. And also something else she brings up that I thought was just kind of curious is that there's no evidence of the citadels, which were part of the complex structure, I guess you would say, but there's no evidence of them actually being used for defense.
Yeah, there's not really any indications of warfare.
Yeah.
It doesn't show up in their arts or what we understand from the writing.
Right.
We don't really know much about their writing, though.
And I think, going back to like the hygiene and the sewers and stuff, they had done studies on the skeletal material from the site, and they found that overall the population was healthier than most other urban societies during that time. But they weren't immune from disease. They did still suffer from, they believe, cholera and malaria.
That was mostly, they said, at the end,
Right.
in the decline of the cities, at least. If not, I don't want to use that for the culture, but for the cities, when they were in decline, the sewer system was a massive investment to maintain it, let alone build it.
Right.
And so when things kind of started to get more difficult and they let that slip, then things would clog, and now you've got standing sewage water that's seeping into the ground, causing all kinds of problems. So that is, my understanding was most of those diseases came from that time period.
Mm-hmm. But it's just interesting, and I think it's something we can kind of all relate to.
Yeah. So you can think of the location of this place as between, I think, India and Pakistan.
I believe.
Yeah, so it's on a river system there, but their trade networks reached as far as the Akkadians, which we talked about last episode.
Right.
Because there are reference, King Sargon of the Akkadians, the first king of that culture, talks about them. Again, it's amazing how much people got around in these ancient times.
It really
it's always
is.
surprising. People think they all just sat in one place and were isolated, but no.
And the vast trade networks that were
huge.
established.
It was huge.
Phenomenal.
Right.
And it's funny because we talk of ourselves today as like, oh, we're in this global economy as if it's kind of a new thing. But in certain aspects, it's kind of not.
Yeah. I think the rate of the globalization.
Right. Yeah, I think it's more a rate than the fact that we are trading and doing
stuff. It does seem
with...
like humans have always had a tendency to do this.
Yeah, which makes sense.
Yeah. All right, so moving on to chapter 7. This one is all about the Jōmon culture in Japan. And this is also, I'm going to say this probably every time, but this is a very interesting civilization, very interesting culture.
Well, one thing I found really interesting about this particular culture is that it spanned over 10,000 years.
Yeah.
Like, wow.
Yeah, and also interesting is they're noted for having the oldest pottery in the world, which is cool. But also interesting to me is they were not agriculture, but they were a very dense society. And essentially, the natural resources in their area were rich enough that they never really needed to develop agriculture. There is some indication they may have had some horticulture, or they may have had some temporary sites, but for the most part, it seems like they lived in one place, and then they just were able to get everything they needed by harvesting the environment around them.
Right, and it's interesting too because it seems like they were pretty much sedentary from the beginning.
Yeah, it actually reminded me a lot of what I remember about the Native American groups in the American Northwest.
Oh yeah.
They were also a similar highly dense population, sedentary, but no agriculture. And that was because they didn't need it. And both of them actually, it seemed like they relied heavily on acorns, because acorns, if you don't know, to process acorns, you need to soak the tannic acids out of them.
Yeah.
So it's not something you can just eat. If you're doing lots and lots of acorns, there's going to be facilities essentially to help you process them. And we find that in both cultures.
And it looks like they had just a wealth, not only of plants, but they had a wealth of animals to rely upon as well. From, I think archaeologists at the site have identified 70 different species of fish and sea creatures and over 50 species of plants that were exploited. So they were getting a really diverse diet.
Yeah, and I think we've touched on this, but it's worth mentioning again. And I know this is fairly common, known for some people at least, that when humans shifted to agriculture, the number of different things we ate was dramatically reduced, and this introduced a lot of health problems.
Right, yes.
So it is important to note that this sort of diet was probably extremely healthy, and they had the environment to allow for it, essentially. Then, in Chapter 8, we move on to the Lapita culture. This is down in the Oceania region, and they are a group of people that are very well known for spreading through islands, essentially, and very early ocean explorers.
And spreading through quite a few islands.
Quite a long ways. It seems like some active colonization was probably going on.
Yes.
We don't know why.
Yeah. What a cool kind of concept, though, because you don't really think of it happening, especially, I don't know, I guess I just don't know a lot about this particular region.
Yeah, so the Lapita originated from a different place and moved to this area. A fair number of the islands had already been inhabited, and so we don't know what that relationship was like. There was definitely trade going on, but basically they colonized some of these islands and then spread out from there and ended up actually colonizing some islands that were so far out no one had ever been to them before. We don't have the vessels, any example of the vessels they used. We think canoes, but that's one of those cases where we just don't have any remains of the actual things they used.
Which I can't remember, Tristan, but was there any art? I don't think she really got into art. I know she talked about folklore, but I was just wondering if any art has been found that may give indications as to what the vessels look like. But I don't think she touches on that.
She talks about some things in the pots, because the pots were very notable red earthen pottery, and then they would incise designs into them and then fill the incisions with white clay or something so it stood out.
That's right, okay.
No mention of any canoes or anything in those, though. In the book. And actually, interestingly, too, as far spread out as they were, you think these, like some of these trips were 900 kilometers.
Yeah.
And you'd think, well, that's a one-way trip. You'll never hear from them again. But in reality, there was a fair amount of back and forth trade, at least when the colonies were new.
Right.
It seems like there may have been effort to actively support new colonies as they developed, and then as they became self-sustaining, then culturally they shifted apart from each other and didn't come in contact as much. And then this is one where the author very carefully notes that there is a shift in culture, but not an end of the culture.
And going back to the ceramics, I was interested because when she was talking about the paste that they would fill the incisions in with, it was a coral paste. I guess ground up coral.
Okay. Yeah.
And being an archaeologist in Florida, I'm like, wow, I'm surprised that something like that doesn't exist within cultural history in Florida that we know of.
Yeah, well, one interesting thing about this group was that they, at least to start with, they weren't building their communities on the shore. They were actually building it on the reefs, if I understood that right. So maybe that presence of reef under your feet resulted in more active use of that. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just like, wow, that's really an interesting use of a natural resource. And I'm like, wait, this is the same natural resource we have here. Why? It's just interesting to see how even with the same resources available to them, different people can utilize them in such different ways. Yeah. Fascinating. Or just not utilize them at all, maybe.
All right. And for Chapter 9, we move down to the mouth of the Amazon River in South America with the Marajoara. The historical fiction bit tells us a little story about a shaman conducting funeral practices, and that is one of the major parts about this culture. That is one thing the author notes too, is a lot of what we know about some of these cultures is based off of burials nearly exclusively.
Right. And I think she also mentions at one time, like, burials can, especially in a stratified culture, can be very different. And so in some cases, we're really only left with the elite class burials. And so it skews our understanding a little.
Yeah, exactly.
But the Marajoara culture dates from around 350 to 1300 CE. But there's some radiocarbon evidence that it was, I guess, occupied during contact, if I understand that correctly.
Yes, it does seem like they may have been living in some of these places up to European contact.
Yeah.
They had more of a region than this, but this chapter is mostly focused on their presence on Marajoara Island, I'm going to say, in the Amazon River, which is a very large the largest river island in a river in the world.
Yeah, which I was like, oh,
Very large, and so they had a large community on top of it. They tended to make mounds to live on to avoid floodwaters. So they're dealing with the extreme drought and the extreme floods of that area. So they're very well adapted to that.
And I thought some of the ways that they engineered system of channels and dams and fish ponds and stuff that allowed them to trap fish, and they said even turtles, to provide meat and, food when the water flooded. It was neat just to understand how they did that, because I can imagine, especially in the Amazonian rainforest, that was a big issue.
Yeah, and this is true for every civilization, every culture out there, but this is a particularly good example of human adaptability.
Yeah.
Because for the longest time, apparently, European archaeologists thought there was no way there was any significantly large cultures in the area because it was too hostile, which now we kind of realize how preposterous that is.
Yeah, I had a hard time grappling with the fact that people thought, because one of the things they talked about is, it's just too tropical.
It fits, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
It fits so well with one of the major points in Four Lost Cities with Anchor, where there's records saying it was this big, and they were like, no way it was that big, because Europeans were looking for what they thought of as a city.
Right, yes.
And so this kind of fits in with that narrative once again, that the biases we came in with as archaeologists trying to study these areas kind of influenced how we understood what we were looking at.
And we see that even here in North America with the Native American mounds. It on the surface it looks like a hill essentially, and they're like, well, this is not really like how can you say a giant like Cahokia sized civilization existed here? These are just earthen mounds. This appears unimpressive or whatever, when in fact it is phenomenally impressive.
There's quite a bit about the burials here. Interestingly, the burials do not seem to be stratified, unlike some of the other cultures we've talked about so far.
I did think it was really fascinating when she was talking about kind of the evolution of funerary practices in this culture and how they went from those giant, essentially jars for people-sized jars that were like 1 meter tall in some cases,
right,
to more of like a churnal situation.
Yeah, so it shifted to they probably left the bodies out for scavengers and then had specially made smaller pots where they would arrange the bones inside.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I was fascinated by that. And also the, I don't know if you would call it hierarchy, but just the way they preferred communal living over individual family dwellings was fascinating to me as well. Just very different from what...
It seems like, at least it seemed to be implied to me that was maybe because the tops of the mounds were very limited in space.
Right, yeah.
So it was more efficient to live communally than individually.
But they do find like hearths that show evidence that maybe even though they were living communally, there were these hearths that were kind of grouped by maybe family or clan or something like that.
My understanding was there was a kind of a trough hearth in all of the longhouses. And then those troughs have in other cultures been an example of more of a matrilineal society. I forget the reasoning for that exactly.
Here, hearth groupings like this are common in many matrilocal societies where the husband goes to live with the wife's community after marriage. It is therefore likely that each longhouse belonged to an extended family where the women were related by blood.
There we go.
Girl power.
Girl power. Yep. There's a fair bit of talk about the ceramics as well, which were very interesting, but...
read the book.
Yeah. And we need to move on to the next chapter, so... Last chapter for today is all about the Minoans, which are definitely not unknown by their name, but I think most people are only aware of them through the Greek mythology.
I was going to say, yeah.
So these are the ones that had the King Minos, the Golden Touch, and the Minotaur and the Labyrinth and all that stuff.
Right.
Of course, that is Greek mythology based off of this culture. It is not actually representative of the culture, although it seems like there could be some basis for truth in that in interesting ways. In particular, they had what have been termed as palaces, but now we don't think of palaces. We think they are more communal buildings and government buildings, essentially.
I did think it was funny because it mentioned in there at one point that they were shifting from calling them palaces to calling them mansions.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, I still don't think that's very accurate.
That doesn't seem to fit what they're saying at all.
Right.
Yeah. But one of the features of this was they weren't particularly well planned, these palaces, as they're called. So when they needed to make an expansion, they just built onto the side of it. And it kind of ended up being a labyrinthine kind of a structure then.
Yeah. And you can still see that in the archaeology and the ruins that are left.
There are still standing ruins, apparently.
Yeah. And I did want to point out too that like this is another culture, like pretty much every culture we've talked about, where they kind of permeated throughout a certain region. And like we find artifacts, Minoan artifacts from like the Greek mainland to the Middle East, Italy, Sardinia, Spain, like they were everywhere through trade and then possibly through secondary trade, meaning, they didn't necessarily land physically on those places, but their cultural material did, which is
they were trading with people, yeah.
And they do talk a little bit about, what their export would have been: olive oil, cloth, even skilled workers, which I was like, you don't usually, at least in this day and age, think of skilled workers as an export item, but yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I remember that for the Indus Valley chapter, there was indication that they had a very specialized way of making beads, was it? The Indus Valley had something that was very specialized, and they were actually, there's indications that there were Indus artisans in Acadia making these beads, because they're making it with their style, their technique, but in a style that pleased the Acadians.
Right.
Which is very interesting. Again, that's a long ways to travel to settle down somewhere else. So yeah, once again, skilled workers, yeah.
And we do understand that they were also expert shipbuilders, so it makes sense that they would be heavily involved in trade. And this is interesting to me too, because in this area of the world, as we know, is heavily, I wouldn't say influenced, but impacted by earthquakes. And so she talks a little bit about how they, some of these sites have seen earthquakes, and that some of the palaces were destroyed possibly by an earthquake or possibly by an invasion. So again, we have, was it that human factor or that environmental factor, or maybe a combination of the two?
Yeah, it suggested that perhaps earthquakes resulting from a volcano disrupted trade enough and weakened them enough that made them vulnerable to invasion, which is definitely a very plausible chain of events, I think.
And again, these folks had sewer pipes. They, again, did have some sort of plumbing, and I found that discussion to be really interesting because...
we're nerds.
Yeah, we're nerds, and I like to see where all the wastewater goes, I guess. I don't know.
Right.
It's kind of important to me. And the discussion on the frescoes was really fascinating, too, just because it seems like they had kind of a unique artistic style compared to other frescoes found in the area. So I thought that was pretty cool.
And other cultures actually picked up the style.
Yeah,
Egypt and Israel, they find similar frescoes. They painted on wet plaster, and I don't quite visualize what that would look like, but it was I can see how that could give a different result.
Yeah, and they showed a picture. They have a couple illustrations, but I wish they had one that was like from another culture so that I can compare the differences, because I've done painting like with watercolor, where you paint on wet paper, wet watercolor, and it does kind of spread the color. And so I'm wondering, I was expecting that kind of effect, but when I was looking at the photo of the fresco, I didn't really see that. So I was like, I wonder what... I noticed there was a lot of like mixing of colors, so I wonder if it makes it a little bit easier to mix the colors. So I noticed it was one of a person.
Yeah.
And so you could see their skin tone, kind of shadows and stuff on it a little better. So maybe that was it. I don't know. But it was cool.
It's all cool.
It really is.
Yeah, and I don't need to go into it too much, but also interesting was they had 3 different writing systems.
Yeah, that was crazy.
So they started off as kind of a pictographic writing system, which was still represented syllables, so it didn't represent whole words. And then they went to what they call line A, and then eventually line B. And line A seems to be, I think, entirely their own invention, whereas the other 2 were derived from another culture.
Right, that's my understanding.
Actually, that brings me back to, I forget which culture this was. It was in this area where she talked about how we have writings, it might have been the Etruscans. We have writings from the Etruscans, and we know where they got their writing system from, and we have bilingual writings from the Etruscans.
Yeah.
But we don't understand the writing. We can't, even with all of that, we don't understand what they're saying in the writing, which boggles my mind. I don't know enough about this, but I thought that's weird and fascinating.
Oh, and I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that women seem to have a slightly different role or status in this culture compared to other similar Bronze Age cultures, I guess, where it wasn't unheard of. They're depicted in art as like powerful figures in religion, administration, and business. And in their art, you very rarely see them in domestic or child rearing settings, which I thought was really interesting.
Very interesting.
So obviously I had to point that out.
So that is everything for today. That is our chapters we're going to cover. What have you thought so far, Barbara?
I'm really enjoying this book. It's interesting to me how much I feel like we don't learn.
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's a ton to learn, but I feel like thinking back on when I was a child and I was in my world history classes and things and how they focused on very few cultures compared to what is out there, or they may have just like brushed the surface, and it's unfortunate, I think.
Well, and so much of these cultures are influenced by other cultures, and so we hear like how the Greeks influenced the Romans, but we don't hear about the other cultures necessarily influencing both of those cultures.
Right. Yeah. And
vice
honestly,
versa.
that kind of bothers me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like it's an incomplete picture of things.
Yeah. I feel like it's doing us an injustice.
Not necessarily you can cover everything, but I feel like you should be able to do a short book on some of these cultures. What we know about them that would help out.
I think it's really important to just understanding how culture works.
Yeah.
I mean, culture changes, cultures merge, and cultures come together to invent new cultures, essentially. And I think we are kind of missing that in our education.
Yeah. And so this book helps with that. I think that is achieving its goal very nicely here.
Yes. And I'm really excited about the next chapter.
Yes, me too, actually. I'm glad you looked ahead too. In the next chapter, we are going to start talking about the Mississippians. And you may remember we talked about them in some length in Four Lost Cities and in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries.
Yes, so I'm excited to see what this author has to say about them.
I am too, very interested, because we had some issues with their depiction in Four Lost Cities, and I'm interested to see if this author upholds some of those things that we had took issue with, or takes it in a different angle.
Yeah, same.
Very interested. So look forward to that next time, because I am. Until then, we'll see you.
All right, happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.